And now, the best 60-ish seconds of your week.
And it's now 45 and 47. And Donald J. Trump becomes the second man in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as President of the United States. Hasn't been done in roughly a quarter and a century since Grover Cleveland won back the presidency after he had lost it to Benjamin Harrison. The comparisons, though, probably end there. Cleveland didn't have to go through anything that Trump did. One interesting correlation was that Cleveland won with a lot of Republican votes, even though he was a Democrat, and Trump won with a lot of Democrat votes, despite the fact that he is a Republican. But Donald Trump had to endure so much in that intervening 4 years as the weaponized Justice Department of Joe Biden came after him with every force they could, actually getting felony convictions against him and taking him to trial, or attempting to take him to trial in other places for criminal charges that were, to buy a bad pun, trumped up. And we all knew it. The American people knew it. Every time they went after him with this criminal stuff, his popularity actually went up. But they also went after him civilly. And he had to endure some really, really difficult times in civil court as well. And of course, there were assassination attempts, constant assassinations of his character in the media, where 95% of the coverage was anti-Trump and, by extension, pro-Biden and pro-Harris. But then, of course, came the assassination attempts on his person. In Butler, when they actually got him with a shot to the ear, thank God he was saved by that moment, and he talked about that in his inaugural address. And then there was, of course, a second assassination attempt, and there may have been others that we didn't know about, because it was very clear that there was a threat to his life, as the media would call it, an existential threat to President Trump's life from Iran and its states around the country and terrorist organizations that it supports, its network of terrorism. So we don't really know how much more was actually out there, but we do know what was seen and the vicious attacks against President Trump, both his character and his person. So he came in on that bitter cold day. The only time that I can recall it being taken indoors was 1985 for Ronald Reagan, a little bit colder than it was this year, but nevertheless it was bitter cold in Washington, D.C., and the trappings and the pageantry was much greater inside the rotunda this time than it was for President Reagan, largely because they had made the decision to move it indoors a little bit earlier. And it was a beautiful day, a really historic inauguration. And not only all of the circumstance and pageantry that goes along with it, but the core was President Trump's inaugural address. And the media has said, and I think in some ways correctly, that it was more of a State of the Union address than a typical inaugural address. But let's say this, it was summed up perfectly in one sentence, the very first one. The golden age of America begins right now. That's what the American people wanted, and that's what they're going to get. President Trump comes into office having gotten a mandate from the American people on November 5th with his highest approval ratings ever, and with the political and real wins to his back. And he has taken full advantage of that in the first couple of days in office. He immediately began to sign these executive orders, most notably having to do with immigration and the southern border, countermanding the nonsense that the Biden administration had foisted upon us, and taking a realistic approach to deporting criminals, violent criminals that are here illegally, back to the countries of their origin, something that every American ought to agree with. But, unfortunately, we begin to hear this whining and ringing and wailing and gnashing of teeth and hand-wringing, etc., that has gone on. But it's the right thing to do, and more importantly, the thing that President Trump promised to do. And so there is a whole mechanism of dealing with the illegal immigration that has occurred, particularly for those violent criminals that have come here. And the other thing, of course, were the pardons. In Trump's case, many of them commutations of people who had actually served time. Those were the quote-unquote January 6thers. And the media, of course, wants to jump all over that. But that's what President Trump promised to do. And it's what the American people voted for. Conversely, Joe Biden, on his way out the door, literally with 15 or 20 minutes left in his presidency, pardons family members, Dr. Fauci, General Milley, and others who had reason to be very concerned about future prosecutions because of things they had done. And he did something again, not unexpectedly, that he had promised not to do. He promised he wasn't going to pardon those people, just as he had promised he wasn't going to pardon Hunter. But President Trump has an additional piece of advice for them, that by giving them pardons, they now are subject to being called as witnesses without the benefit of being able to claim the Fifth Amendment, because there's no protection needed. So sometimes these pardons are a double-edged sword. We'll have to wait and see. But the pardons that President Trump gave were ones that he had promised, ones that he had been open and quote-unquote transparent about. The ones Joe Biden did, exactly the opposite. 8,000 plus pardons, by the way, that Joe Biden issued during his presidency. Have to ask ourselves whether all of them were deserved. And finally, President Trump goes to the National Cathedral, as presidents always do, the day after the inauguration for a day of national prayer. Now, the National Cathedral calls itself a house of prayer for all people, meaning that it's open to all religious faiths, etc. But in point of fact, it is the cathedral, the main church of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C., the Episcopal Church. And their bishop is in charge. And she, interestingly a female bishop, came to the cathedral that day and in her sermon castigated President Trump and his administration eye to eye with the President of the United States, his family and friends. You know, on the very basic level, that's bad manners. You don't invite somebody into your house and then embarrass them or attempt to embarrass them. But you know, we talk about politics here on the best 60-ish seconds of your week, so I'll stray into another area you're not supposed to talk about, that, and that's religion. Because this was quintessential stuff, unfortunately, out of the Episcopal Church now. These mainline Protestant denominations. The Episcopal Church, by the way, used to be called the Republican Party of Prayer. It was the church to which almost all of the founders belonged, because they had come out of the Church of England, which is the mother church of the Episcopal Church. But it has gone so far off the main path of Christianity, to the point where this Bishop Budde has, preached heresy from the pulpit there at the Washington National Cathedral. Really tragic and sad when they forsake the gospel of Jesus Christ for wokeism, the LBGTQ agenda, etc., as she put forth in the sermon that day. It was an embarrassment, and people ought to just walk away from the National Cathedral and everything that she's had to say. President Trump, I think, was kind in his rebuke of her, because what she did was totally and completely out of line. Wish we could end on a happier note than that, but for now, that is the best 60-ish seconds of your week.